Okay, good morning to everyone attending this morning and welcome to the IST Brown Bag sessions. I'm Chipi Buenafe and I'll be both the host and the guest speaker for this month's session. But before we begin, we'd like to share with you a few reminders. Please work in an environment where background noises can be muffled at the very least. You may use the chat box if you have any concerns during the webinar. Please make sure to indicate that it's selected to all panelists. During the Q&A portion, you may type your questions in the Q&A window if you have any questions. But if you have questions already throughout the session, you may go ahead with the Q&A box and go in and type in your questions. Of course, be attentive and avoid distractions. Now, if you're facing any technical difficulties with Zoom, please log out and log back in again. This is not really a definitive fix, but normally this help reset whatever settings that you might have that could have contributed to some clog ups or snags with your connection with us in the webinar. And with that, okay, we'll go right away with the session. The title of the session is Making Decisions Better, a review of themes and tools in modern decision theory. Now, it's quite interesting in the sense that um, this is not really a new topic, but if you'd like to know more in depth on the technical details, so to speak, about modern decision theory and how it is structured as modern decision theory, I'd like everyone to go ahead and have a copy of the book. The title of the book is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Daniel Kahneman, he's actually a Nobel Prize winner for economics back in 2002. Okay, but much of his work, he was one half of the pair, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So they were both from Israel and then they migrated to the US and they've done a lot of work in psychology, especially in behavioral economics. So they were the ones who really revolutionized a lot of these things. And unfortunately, Amos Tversky passed away in the late 90s. So when the Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded for the contributions in behavioral economics, only Daniel Kahneman was around to actually receive the award. As you may know, the Nobel Prizes are only given to those who are still living. So they're not awarded posthumously. But in any case, Daniel Kahneman is still alive, and he's done a lot of improvements to the literature since 2002. Now, I don't intend to really cover a lot based on the book and based on other relevant resources in the field. I do hope that I will touch on critical points, really. I mean, points or themes that I feel would be very useful for us moving forward. And again, if you're interested to learn more, learn deeply about the topic, we can go ahead and talk about go ahead and go through the book that I've shared. Okay. Now, uh, at the heart of today's topic is the word decision. Now, and I think it would be nice for us to define what decision is. Well, decision is nothing more than cognitive choice. Okay, it's cognitive choice. You'll probably have a lot of definitions for decisions, but for today, I would use this definition for choice, cognitive choice. So let's start with the word choice. I mean, what does it entail? Well, first, it entails data or givens. For those of you who are familiar with Latin, okay, data or datum means given, okay, givens. So choice would always be something that has to be based on givens. Okay, naturally, choice doesn't really come from things that are not given. I mean, there's going to be no motivation, there's no impetus to actually choose something without any givens. Okay. Now, another aspect of choice is the existence of alternatives. There are options. Okay, and that's what makes choice really. I mean, you're choosing from a different set of options. If there are no choices to begin with, if there are no alternatives, then there's really no choice. That's why we say no choice, right? There's no choice. So the element of the decision is missing. Okay, you can't really decide on anything if there's no choice to begin with. And lastly, another important facet of choice is that there are consequences, there are outcomes. And normally, when somebody makes a choice, the consequences, the outcomes are what is also considered in the element of choice. Now, when we look at decisions, the word cognitive comes into the picture. It is important as well because this what differentiates human beings from animals. Okay, and I would even argue animals cannot make choices. Okay, and one element of cognitive or the word cognitive is that choices or decisions are a mental activity, if you may. Okay, it is a decision. It's a human decision. It's a human act rather, because it involves the mind. It involves the intellect to actually come up with a decision. Okay, now and as I said earlier, animals do not um, choose. Technically speaking, they can be conditioned. Okay, and the reason why that is so is because animals react. They don't deliberate, they don't think about things, they just react. Okay, so they receive stimuli, and based on that stimulus or stimuli, they react to the stimulus, to the stimuli. Okay, now conditioning, okay, for those of you familiar with the groundbreaking work of Pavlov, it's conditioning is a process wherein the body of the animal, okay, or the physiology of the animal adjusts to the recurring patterns of stimuli. In which case, once that stimulus is introduced again, the body can react quickly to the stimulus. So the idea of conditioning comes into the picture in that aspect. But if you've noticed, I mean, because of that, you can't really say that animals decide or choose. Okay. Now, another facet of the cognitive characteristic of decision is that it's a process. Okay, it might feel instantaneous, it might feel intuitive. Okay, we'll talk more about intuition in a while, but there's always going to be a process involved. So there's always this step-by-step procedure, if you may, whenever a decision is taken or is conducted. So overall, when you look at decision, you take a look at these five aspects, if you may. Okay, so on the right hand side, you have data, you have alternatives, you have consequences, which comprise the element of choice or the component of choice. And on the left side, you have mental and process as your descriptors for the component that is cognitive. Okay. And one of the things that Kahneman and the rest of the scholars of modern decision theory looked into in recent years was the fact that you can describe the human mind as having two players or two agents or two characters. And Daniel Kahneman, in his book, talks about system one and system two. Now, this is not a term that came from Kahneman. He was actually basing it from an earlier reference, okay, wherein that author used system one and system two. But he gives a disclaimer also in his book, which I'll also repeat now, is that system one and system two are not systems per se, meaning they are not a composite of parts that can be found biologically in the human person. It's no different from simply labeling them as the fast and slow parts of the human mind. Okay, but These are important characteristics of System 1 and System 2 because System 1 is the intuitive player of the human mind, whereas the System 2 is the deliberate player of the human mind. Okay, so these characteristics of fast, intuitive, this would describe System 1, whereas slow and deliberate, this would describe System 2. And all decisions that every human being would undertake, there's always going to be an interplay with System 1 and System 2. Okay. Now, the curious thing about it is sometimes, okay, System 1 is able to influence System 2, and System 2 is able to help regulate System 1. Okay. But the thing here is that it's not an all perfect framework, so to speak. Okay. And you'll probably have some idea here. System 1 works very fast. Okay. It works very fast, but it tends to skip out a few things. Okay. And the reason why that is so is because of certain biological needs. For example, in the case of an emergency, you don't really have to activate your system 2 in the case of a fire or an earthquake or a disaster. Typically, your system 1 will just kick in and take over everything else. Okay. And that's required because your survival would be at stake. Okay. Whereas for system 2, it's slow, it's deliberate. But then system 2 tends to be so focused on certain things that it has the possibility of being oblivious to everything else. Okay, so it may not have the facility, or as what the book would say, cognitive ease, to actually look at other aspects of the reality in order for them to make that decision. So you can see that both system one and system two are important now. Um, I won't go through at length to describe a grocery list of characteristics for both System 1 and System 2. Okay, later on throughout this session, I will probably share bits and pieces of those characteristics. But in general, the book will say it in more detail. For our purposes, it's just good enough to appreciate the difference for both, knowing that system one is that part of the brain that takes care of your decision making that is fast and intuitive. And system two is part of the decision making process of your mind that takes care of the slow and deliberative side. Okay. And the very first theme in modern decision theory that is quite important, which we will see the interplay of system one and system two, is the aspect of heuristic. Okay, so what do we mean by heuristic? Okay, the technical definition of heuristic is the ability to simplify very complex questions by substituting the complex question with a simple question. Okay, and the important thing about heuristics is that it enables us to answer the complex question by substituting it with a simpler question and come up with an answer that is adequate but not necessarily perfect. Okay, so it's like an approximation. For example, if somebody asks you, "How are you feeling right now?" Okay, I mean, how are you feeling right now? Um, it can be a very complex question because you probably, if your system two activates now, how are you feeling right now? Then you take a look at all of the elements that has happened to you during the day or during the week or anything in your most recent experiences. Okay, from your most recent experiences, you will notice that this question can be pretty loaded, but we don't really consciously go into that process, and our system one would activate by coming up with a substitute question. So maybe what we will answer to that question, how you're feeling right now, would be, what would be your mood now? I mean, are you hungry? Are you bored? Are you upset? Okay. So the question is, how are you feeling right now would be substituted with what's your mood currently. Or if somebody asks you, do you like your job? Okay. So there's so many things about your job that you really like. So uh, I like the work. I like the interaction with my office mates, with my colleagues. I like the challenge. I like the flexibility. But then you'd probably substitute that with perhaps a relationship with your immediate supervisor. So the answer to the question, how do you like your job, would be the answer that you would answer to a simpler question would be, how's my relationship with my boss? Okay. So that's how heuristics work. Okay. Sometimes in the face of very complex questions, because of the need to come up with an answer quickly, and we're hardwired to do that because of our instinct, okay, we sometimes substitute it with a simpler question, okay, and answer that simpler question, knowing for the fact that that answer is adequate. It will do, but it's not exactly accurate. It's not exactly perfect, but it will do. Okay. And heuristic actually has the same source as a phrase or a quip that we normally hear when we say eureka. No, so somebody said eureka. Okay. Okay. So there's this insight that comes to you that pops in your head right now when you say eureka. Well, it's actually coming from the same Greek source, Greek etymology as heuristics. Okay. So now let's take a look at some of the finer points or details of heuristics. Okay, and you will probably hear this term, okay, that will always be attached to heuristics, and this would be biases. Okay, heuristics is are those systematic ways of doing substitutions for complex questions. Okay, and because of that tendency to substitute things, okay, they actually form biases, and we will see some of those in a while. Okay, so the first theme in heuristics, and this was one of the first things that Kahneman shared, is what he calls, or what they call with Tversky, the law of small numbers. Now, for those of you who are statistically inclined, you've probably heard of the law of large numbers, right? Um, and in a form of a parody, okay, the law of small numbers is that tendency that humans have where heuristics come into the picture. So let's take a look at this example. Okay, suppose you toss a fair coin 6 times. Now, a fair coin would always have 50% heads, 50% tails as probability. Okay, the result is as follows. H is head, T is tail. So you have H, 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 T, H. So tails came up on the fifth toss. Okay. Now let me ask you this question. If you toss that same coin for a seventh time, what is the likelihood that it would be tails? Okay, so very quickly, if you guys would want to give a shot, maybe you can chat with me, I mean, to all panelists. What do you think is the likelihood that the seventh toss would actually be a tail? So maybe I'll just pause a bit. I want to hear your thoughts. Maybe in the chat box you share with us. What's the likelihood? I mean, from 0 to 100, what's the likelihood that it's going to be a tail? So yeah, let's see. Let's see. Tingnan natin. Are you guys giving yourselves some thoughts? Okay. Okay, we see that. Okay, okay. Okay. Now, when this survey was conducted, okay, uh, a grand majority of the participants said that tails would be the most likely outcome for the seventh toss. Okay. And they gave a very huge weight to tails being as the most likely outcome for the seventh toss. Okay, but here's where the problem is. Okay, each toss, as you know, would be an independent event. Okay, in other words, all the previous events will not impact the current event. Okay, and that said, because they are independent events, okay, the probability of tails happening on the seventh time would still be the same probability as it had in each of those 6 times. So in other words, the answer really to this question is that it's still 50%. Okay. And yet, when the respondents answered this question, they had the tendency to say that, okay, tails would be most likely to come up in your seventh toss. Okay. And that's a problem. So now you see that, okay, from an objective point of view, okay, it's still going to be 50-50. Okay. But why is it? Why is it that people, when they saw this problem or they saw this question, they had the predisposition to say, more likely than not, it would be tails. Okay, and this is what Kahneman said about the law of small numbers. Because we're thinking intuitively, okay, that if we were to extend the idea of having many tosses in the future, we're hoping that the average will happen. We're gonna hope that eventually the tails will come up in the tosses because you have a lot of heads at the start. But if you look at it objectively, each toss is actually an independent event. Okay, in which case it will still be 50-50. So what happened here? And this is what they say that the law of small numbers. It's not really a law, it's a parody, right? Because it comes from the idea of the law of large numbers, wherein if you have a very large sample size, then the large sample size is supposed to be reflective of your population. Okay. So anything that you do with your large sample, okay, that would be descriptive of your population, ideally in a large number. Now, the heuristic there is that the human mind makes this shortcut that, okay, if I do this in a large number, then I can do this in a smaller number. And that's the parody of the law of small numbers. Now, one of the uh, effects of thinking in these lines, so that what happens in the large can happen in the smaller numbers. I mean, the one of the challenges or issues that we find ourselves in would be the concept of confirmation bias, right? Wherein we have a problem, we have a situation. Okay, what we do is we try to look for things in the environment that would confirm what we're thinking, which is a little bit weird, especially if we're in a very scientific discipline. Okay, as you know, especially in statistics. Okay, and for those of you who are uh, philosophers of science, so to speak, science is really a method or a discipline of rejection or a discipline of negation, right? You're always looking for counter examples, okay? And that's why you run many experiments, because if you keep on running many experiments, all it takes is just one instance wherein a contrary outcome happens, and that's it. That's why you keep on running experiments. And that's why when you do experiments, you don't just do one or two experiments, you do many experiments. And if the outcome is still the same, then there's a stability of result, right? But the whole philosophy of science is that it's always premised on rejection. Okay. You have to look for counterexamples. Okay. If you cannot look for a counterexample, then it doesn't mean that it is true. You just cannot reject it. I mean, there's a terminology there. But for us, we don't really embark on doing many experiments, okay, in order for us to come up with the stability of the outcome. Sometimes we're content with just doing a few things. We just look for a few cases just to confirm our hypothesis, and that's it. And we go and that's why they call this jumping to conclusions, because it's really a heuristic process. So we jump right away, and then that's where we see that, okay, we say that we jump to conclusions. That's confirmation bias. Okay, so that's one of the things that the law of small numbers point out. The danger of us falling into what is known as confirmation bias. In order for us to confirm whatever hypothesis we have, we just look for things around us to confirm what we're thinking, right? Now, another theme in heuristics is the concept of anchors. uh, so here's another example. Okay, Pope Saint John Paul II died at the age of 84. Okay, so without looking into the internet, how old is Pope Francis now? Okay, now some of you might be thinking, okay, so if your thought process would probably go something like this without going through Google, right? Okay, when did John Paul II die? Okay, he died sometime in 2005. Okay, so that's 15 years ago. Okay, and then Pope Francis actually came after um, Pope Benedict XVI, so he wasn't really the successor of John Paul II. And then you start thinking, okay, if I factor this in and that, okay, maybe Pope Francis would be, no, you'd be thinking, okay, if John Paul II died at the age of 84, Pope Francis back then might be younger. Okay, I mean, you'd expect that to be younger. Maybe you'd probably be thinking, okay, some number. But then when you start to interpolate and extrapolate your numbers, then you'll come up with a figure. Now, similar surveys found out that if I change the number to, let's say, 144, okay, the answer to the same question, how Pope Francis would be right now, would be inflated. Okay, and the reason for that is, as we view this question, we are anchored with the number 84. Okay. Now, for those of you really curious to the fact, Pope Francis right now is 83. Okay. So I mean, that's just a fact right there. But you may have given an answer that is probably lower than 83. You probably would have given an answer that is around maybe 60, on the upper 60s or the lower 70s. Okay. Which underestimated the actual fact. Okay. So anchors or anchoring is it has this priming effect. It primes our mind. It conditions us in a way that in the absence of any fact that is verifiable, like going to Google, System 1 takes this data 84 as gospel truth. Okay. And then after you do the anchoring, okay, you do the adjusting. So now, okay, if I use this as an anchor, I know that this is not really relevant to the answer to my question. Okay. If you've noticed, the question how old Pope Francis is now, the age of John Paul II is irrelevant to the age of Pope Francis now. But more likely than not, you would have used that to actually make approximations to answer the question of how old Pope Francis is. So intuitively, you made use of the number 84 as an anchor, and then you adjusted. Okay, so based, okay, maybe John Paul II is like a senior classman to Pope Francis, I mean, yeah, they probably, the age gap won't be that big, etc., 15 years apart. Okay, so you've made all those mental adjustments. Okay, but if you've noticed, those two statements above, okay, they're irrelevant, they're not related to one another, right? Those facts don't really connect. Okay, and yet you made use of these facts to actually come up with an answer to the question how old Pope Francis is now. Okay, so that's how anchoring affects us. Okay, it gives it primes us. Now whatever information that we have, even if it is not connected or relevant to the question at hand, we will still use it somehow. Okay, and this leads us to another bias known as the availability bias. Okay, availability bias is somewhat similar to confirmation bias, wherein we tend to make use of data that is available to us, and we make use of that data even if the data is not connected or relevant to what we're looking for. Okay, it may give us an approximation, but truth to be told, there's no connection. Like in our example above, okay, there is no connection with the age of Pope Francis and then John Paul II. There's really no connection there, right? But somehow you try to make those connections, so you were anchored. So we have the tendency to have this predisposition for the availability bias. Okay, we make decisions, we come up with answers to questions based on data that is not relevant to the question. Okay, so and that's pretty dangerous, especially if the connection is really far off, right? So, but you're just anchored because you're Your mind is designed that way. Okay, it scans the field very quickly. Okay, it gathers that data and then makes the immediate connections as much as possible, even if there's none. Okay, so our associative abilities are running full gear, even if in theory, in reality, doesn't there's really no connection. Okay, so that's the danger of availability bias. Okay, there's this example, and you probably have seen this story circulated maybe a year or so back in World War II. Okay, when they were collecting data of where the airplanes. They were collecting data regarding airplanes during World War II. Okay, and normally they'd get data on uh, where in the airplane would they be shot. Okay, so they would have this diagram. Okay, and they will point out areas in the airplane wherein the shot the airplane gets shot. Okay, so there's this a scattering, like a scatter diagram. Okay, and then the conclusion there was that, okay, so the guys in the Air Force said, okay, for those that had many bullet holes, so to speak, by the wings or so and so forth, okay, why don't we put reinforcement in those parts of the airplane? Okay, but one statistician actually said, no, you don't put reinforcement on those bullet holes. You actually put reinforcement on those that did not show in our data to have any hits. Why is that? Because more likely than not, if they were hit in those areas, they wouldn't have been able to come back. Okay, so another cousin of availability bias is survivorship bias. Okay, wherein we only look at what's available to us, but we do not see the converse, okay, or the flip side, or the inverse rather, of the situation, wherein that is probably more relevant. Okay, in the case of the World War II planes. Okay, so they put reinforcements. So eventually they decided to put reinforcements on areas that didn't show in their scatter plots, because more likely than not, if the plane was hit in those areas, they will not be able to come back and provide that data for everyone. So that's another story regarding availability bias, okay, in anchors. Okay. Now, another theme in heuristics is representativeness. Okay, so here's another survey question that I'll throw at you guys. Okay, Sam is a recent graduate of UANP, very analytical and detail oriented, not very creative, tends to be more introverted, but has a deep moral sense. Okay, so the question I have right now is, from which program did Sam most likely graduate? So I'll pause for a while. I'll let you think about it. Okay. And if you want to chat your answers. I mean, what program would Sam would be part of? What Sam is a student of which program? Okay. Now, for those of us who are familiar with UANP, okay, I'm willing to make a bet that you're thinking that Sam is probably a student of SSE. Okay. But the thing there is that if you analyze the situation very, very carefully, okay, you would have been able to come up with what is known as a base rate. Okay. And what's the base rate? Well, you probably have taken all of the programs, okay, and take a look how many percent of the population would have been in these programs. Okay. And perhaps now you would notice that, okay, based on our base rate, there is a big likelihood that a student of UANP is actually a student of the School of Management. So you may have selected that person. Okay, I mean, that person may have been a business ad or a management student. Okay, and that would have the higher base rate compared to somebody from IT or from applied math or industrial engineering, which has a lower base rate. So the question is, Sam is least likely to be a graduate of IE of AM or of IT based on the base rate of UA and P. Okay, and yet, more likely than not, you may have thought of Sam being a graduate of any of the SSE programs. So that is another example of the problem, okay, or the issue of representativeness. Okay, instead of us looking at the base rate, so to speak, of a population, okay, we look at the descriptions, okay, provided for there, and then okay, we say that okay, more likely than not, this person Sam is an SSE person, but without any further data, okay, apart from the base rate, which would have been more accessible, um, you actually may have chosen a lesser likely choice, okay, which would have been SSE. You would have, but you may have omitted the fact that okay, a graduate of UANP has it's more likely that a graduate of UANP would have been in any of the School of Management programs based on the base rate. Okay, so this is another issue known as the representativeness bias. Okay, and normally this would be peculiar with discrimination types of biases, right? So, for example, whenever companies hire new employees and they look at the schools, right? So they will take a look at, okay, I mean, what school did you come from? Um, okay, but sometimes um, you will realize, I mean, the employers will realize that they tend to get better employees, better hires, not coming from the better schools. Okay, but what happened there? I mean, what was the issue? Well, employers or the recruiters actually fell to the representativeness bias. So just because they came from certain schools, then they make that connection that okay, since this person came from this school, then therefore this person will have these certain set of qualities, which may not be true, okay, which may not be 100% accurate, okay. And to be fair, okay, the may perhaps the schools would have had any bearing in the formation of that particular new hire, okay, but it's not 100% connect, it's not totally accurate, okay. And we can still be prone to the representativeness bias, okay, here. And another term for this is stereotyping. Sometimes we stereotype people, okay, even if they're not really the case. Okay, like for example, and again, this is where the typical discrimination issues come into the picture. Let's say if Sam was okay, going back to the example of Sam. Okay, let me ask you, what do you think is the gender of Sam? Okay, you might be curious. Now, Sam, it's intentionally named Sam because Sam can mean to be a boy or a girl. Okay. Um, had it been a more feminine name, for example, Mary, okay, you probably would have answered the question that this person, Mary, might have been a com. Oh, no, not really com student because not very creative, but maybe somewhere a little bit more more quiet. Okay, you'd probably want to go into something more economics, maybe, or something a little bit more humanities, perhaps. But because Sam is predisposed to be a manly name, okay, it is possible that okay, this Sam might be an engineer. So your tendency, the first thing that comes to your mind, okay, this person might be an SSE student. Okay. So that's an example of stereotyping. We're in okay, based on gender, based on race. So for example, if you're coming from a certain province, okay, just because you came from that province, that you've been given that label to be a very good cook, okay, or you're labeled to be very arrogant, okay, even if it's not exactly true, okay. So there. I mean, that's another danger of heuristics. Now we can fall into that trap of a representativeness bias. Okay. Now, another issue is overconfidence because we're doing things very, very quickly. Uh, the thing there is that system one tends to influence system two in saying that, whatever information I gather, meaning system one, that's true. And system two doesn't really do much double checking there. You're working in the same team. So, okay, yeah, you trust whatever system one tells you, okay, at first glance. And that can lead to overconfidence. So let's have this another example. Sam has a master's degree in education and has been teaching for 10 years. While having no graduate degree, Andy has 13 years teaching. Okay, COVID happened. Who will succeed as a teacher now? Okay. Now, uh, overconfidence, again, if you're just given this set of information, okay, one differentiating factor here would have been the existence of a graduate degree. Okay. You might be thinking right now, and it's not entirely wrong, you might be thinking right now that Sam would be poised to succeed as a teacher now. Okay. But we fail to appreciate the fact that this is what is known as a rare event. Okay. COVID-19, as we're experiencing it now, hasn't happened before, at least for those in this current generation. So both of them didn't have any experience in managing COVID-19. So the correct answer here would be anybody. It could be Sam, it could be Andy. Because the current situation, okay, hasn't existed for both their cases. Okay? And this leads us to the danger of having that illusion of validity and skill. Just because a certain person would have this certain set of skills or certain endowments, that no matter what happens, okay, this person will still emerge as the more probable candidate to succeed. Okay, but truth of the matter is that in case of rare events, in case of events with low predictability, now expert intuition, as they say, and this is what Kahneman said. Okay, expert intuition fears no better than a toss of a coin. Okay, in cases of low predictability. Okay, and they've run through a lot of research studies. One example would be predicting where the stock market would go. So they had computers running the prediction, they had experts doing their prediction. And you know what? When they did their prediction, time passed, time to compare the predictions, the experts didn't do any better. They actually performed worse. Okay. Of course, the computers didn't perform any better. They weren't really able to predict what happened, but they performed better than the experts. And yet they're experts. What gives? Okay. That is a trap that's mentioned by Kahneman regarding overconfidence. Just because we've had certain endowments, we know a few things much more than the others. In the event of a low predictability, we think that these things will carry us through, but they don't. Okay, especially if they're not connected. Okay, so and this is leads us to another fallacy known as the planning fallacy. So especially we're seeing this right now with the COVID-19 situation. Just because we have all experts coming from medicine, from economics, now gathering together, putting our minds in there. Okay, then we have a plan. Okay, we have a master plan. Okay, let's do this. Let's do policy A, B, C, D, E. And guess what? I mean, doesn't really lead to anything successful. Okay, and a good example for that in recent months would be Singapore. Okay, the Singaporeans, they've been given this label that they're very, very good people. I mean, they're very, very intelligent, very smart. Within Southeast Asia, they have the best professionals out there, very disciplined. Okay, earlier parts, we're starting to see their successes. They've been able to control their infection rates. But lo and behold, yeah, I mean, they weren't really able to contain it. Okay, something happened. Okay, and yet they had a plan. They had a perfect plan. They're really good. and yet they failed. The thing there is that they were also in a situation, like everybody else, a situation of low predictability. So, what do you say here? I mean, I'm not saying that planning is useless, okay? If the situation is a situation of high predictability, meaning it's a situation where this has happened before, okay, it has happened many times already in the past, then planning will work and it would be prudent to do some planning, okay? On the other hand, for events with low predictability, planning, well, okay. I mean, you do it. It's better to have a plan than none. But don't expect your plan to be foolproof. Don't expect that following your plan to the dot would actually lead you to success. Okay? Because you are ignoring also the fact that because it is a low predictable event of low predictability, you will ignore the fact that, okay, there's no reference of success, right? Nobody has done it before. Okay? Nobody has succeeded in this. So you have no reference. You don't have any basis. So any plan would be a good plan in this respect. Okay. In a sense, um, it's good for us to always keep in mind, okay, the context of the situation whenever we do some planning. Okay, and sometimes we fall into the trap. Okay, we have to have the best plan, right? But then the situation is new. Nobody has had any experience with it. Okay, now with regard to overconfidence, this is just really not to discourage you, right? One situation wherein this is applicable in the case of entrepreneurs. Okay, so you've been hearing a lot of books about how to be successful. If you really want to have a very successful business, you do this A, B, C, D, E. But you fail to appreciate the fact that 80% of startups fail after 2, 3 years. So what gives? Okay. So there now you start to see, oh man, no, I mean, yeah, I mean that's a so no matter how good of a plan, I mean it's not that plans are useless, right? They can only get you so far. And in events with low predictability, it's not going to be very far. Okay, so as long as you accept that fact that it will only get you so far, and that's not very far, then okay. I mean, you're there. I mean, at least you're ready to accept whatever fate that comes your way. Okay, so that's another tendency that we have. Okay, overconfidence. Now, another major area that's shared in decision theory is the idea of prospects. Now, when we talk about prospects, we look at the term prospect, no, perspective, retrospective. So spectus means vision, to see. So seeing things forward. No. Now, the idea of prospect theory or prospects is that when people make decisions, they always have a reference point. Okay. They do not look at it impersonally. They don't look at it from a 10,000 foot view. Whenever they make decisions, they always look at it with a certain view. Okay. And that is the reference point. And that's why every decision made is a personal choice. Okay. It's a personal choice. And sometimes when we criticize people for making certain decisions, okay, we tend to look at it in a so-called objective manner. We detach ourselves from the situation, look at it very coldly, and say, well, this person didn't choose correctly. But we fail to appreciate the fact that every decision that a person makes, there's a perspective to that. Okay, there's a vision, there's a reference point to that. So every choice is a personal choice, and that's what we fail to appreciate. And that's why we notice that why is it that this person is so smart and all these things, but made this poor decision? Right? Maybe what we've not seen is the fact that this person has made a choice from a certain perspective, from a certain vision. Okay. So let's take a look at a gamble. Okay. So let's say you're offered a gamble on a toss of a coin. Okay. If you able to come up with heads, you win 1,000 pesos. If it shows tails, you lose 1,500 questions. So the question here right now is, will you accept the gamble or not? Will you be willing to make the bet or not? Well, in most surveys that has been conducted, regardless of your payoff, okay, more likely than not, people would say no. I won't go ahead with the bet. Why? Well, you can argue, objectively speaking, it's 50-50. You can argue. But most people would shy away from the bet because of what is known as loss aversion. Okay? Uh, People are more concerned about what they lose rather than what they would gain, even if they're both equivalent. Okay? So sometimes even the language is important, right? If the language says that you will lose something because it is a personal perspective that I'm losing something, okay, I'd be more averse to losing something than to gain something, which may be equivalent, right? For example, in our earlier gamble, okay, and even if we say that they're both 1,000 pesos, regardless of the outcome, either you win 1,000 or you lose 1,000, right? But if we change the gamble such that when you participate in the gamble, okay, supposing you say that, okay, I mean, I pay 500 pesos, okay, for the gamble, okay. If I get heads, then I get 1,500. If I get tails, I don't get anything. Those are equivalent gambles. I mean, you can come up with a gamble that is logically equivalent, but the context changes from the perspective of the person. In the new gamble that I've just constructed now, the difference is that I had to pay something in order for me to participate in the gamble. In this earlier example, I didn't pay anything. Okay. And yet they could be equivalent. Okay. So depending on how the gambles are constructed, there could be different preferences, which doesn't make sense if you think about it. They're actually logically equivalent. Why is it that it changed? So the source of that is really the idea that the perspective of loss comes into the picture. I mean, there are certain gambles wherein loss is more prominent in the vision of the decision maker, whereas in certain gambles, it's viewed more as a gain rather than as a loss. And yet they could be equivalent gambles. Okay, they could be equivalent situations. What's another example? If you go to a store and you have the option to pay in cash or in credit card. Okay. But you know that if you're going to use a credit card, you might be given a charge, right? So the normal reaction would be, I put the price and I'll just inform the buyer, you'll have to pay additional surcharge if you use your credit card. Okay. The reaction of the buyer would be, I might not want to buy this if I plan to use the credit card, right? On the other hand, you can have an equivalent situation wherein the store will put a higher amount, wherein it could be equivalent to the amount of, of the cash plus the surcharge. And then I tell the buyer, if you pay in cash, you will actually get a discount, which is equivalent to the original retail price. In the second situation, the second scenario, the buyer would be more predisposed to actually buy the product because of a potential gain. I get a discount. But if you look at it, they're just both equivalent situations. It is how you've shaped the perspective of the buyer. Okay. So and part of that is that we're attuned to loss aversion, which makes sense. I mean, we're wired for self-preservation, so we don't really want to lose a lot more than when we can afford, right? And another aspect here is endowment effect. Okay, so because we have we make decisions based on a certain perspective, we take a look at what we already have. Okay, for example, I look at this gamble, and if I were a millionaire, my reaction to this, well, why not, right? But if you're somebody who's perhaps a worker who doesn't really get much from your daily salary, your decision might be something else. You might not want to take this. And yet it's the same gamble. And yet, objectively speaking, you know the mathematical or the statistical analysis for that. It would be the same anyway. But the choices were different because of their different reference points, their different come from states. Okay. And this is why it's important to consider goals as reference points. You'll notice the difference when goals are short-term goals versus long-term goals. Okay. Um, and you'll notice that even if they can be made equivalent, the person's reaction to either goals would be different, right? Um, and and sometimes it is more difficult for people to have a long-term goal because of the potential variability of losses that can come along the way. Okay. Unlike if it's a short-term goal, I can manage the losses that can happen in between and I can achieve the goal, which is why it's so ideal for motivation purposes to have goals that are short-term, that are precise, that are definite. Okay. And you don't really need to set goals that are far off, right? For example, if I have a goal, let's say the university has a goal to make sure that we get 2,000 students by 2030. Okay, that's a very far off goal. That's still 10 years. Versus having a goal of maybe getting 100 students by 2021. Okay. And you can construct your goals, your short-term goals, such that when you reach 2030, it would have been the same goal of additional 2,000. Two equivalent situations, but how they are structured is completely different. Okay. That's another uh, theme in prospect theory about goals as reference points. Okay. Now another theme in 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 modern decision theory, in prospect theory, is the concept of decision weights. So when we decide on things, we put weights differently to various alternatives. So what's an example here? Suppose your chances to win 1 million pesos is increased by 5%. Which situation would you prefer? Would you prefer a situation wherein you had 0% chance of winning 1 million to 5%? Or from 5% to 10%? Okay. Now, suppose you have this other pair of alternatives. Which would you prefer? A 90% winning to 95%? Or 95% to 100%? Okay. Now, you'll notice that these two pairs, they actually introduce or illustrate the idea of the possibility effect and the certainty effect. In that example, you may have chosen 0 to 5 versus 5 to 10. Why? Because in 0 to 5, 0% means you won't get anything. 5%, now you have a possibility. Okay, possibility effect. You have a possibility of getting something. Whereas 5% to 10%, the possibility has always been there. Okay. And for you, it's pretty low. I mean, it's still 10%. It's not even above 50%, right? Whereas on the second pair, this introduces the idea of certainty effect. Okay, you would have preferred from 95 to 100%. Why? Because it's certain. Now it's 100%. You get 1 million. You'd prefer that. Okay. Whereas from 90 to 95, it's very high. If you notice, it's very high. 90% to 95%. Oh, I mean, it's much higher. Okay, but you'd probably prefer something to more certain. And if you've noticed, when we start to weigh our decisions, okay, you'll notice that it's not in a straight line. It's not proportional to one another. You'd probably have something more skewed at the end between zero, okay, from zero, and then from 100%. The skews are the weights are skewed. Okay, there. But somewhere along the way in between, you'd notice that it's not going to, it would be underweighted. Okay, so the weights are not really distributed evenly. And that leads us to the phenomenon of overestimation and overweighting. Okay, so we're in certain situations, we think that we would prefer a certain scenario more than the other, okay, because of either the possibility or the certainty effect, okay. Another issue in decision weights would be the idea of vividness, okay. Right now in our experiment, in our survey, we've been talking about money, numbers. But what if it were something in kind? Let's say a rare item. Let's say if I give you like a rare item, okay, how much would you be paying for that rare item if you have a chance, and how much would you be willing to sell it? And in those surveys, they would notice that even if the monetary value of that item is low because you were willing to pay low for it, the barrier for you to sell it is much higher. So there's no clearing effect. And the reason for that is that vividness. I mean, the idea that no, this is a product that probably has sentimental value and all that. So that's where the vividness comes into the picture. Sometimes we tend not to make the right decision, so to speak, because of certain reasons other than the monetary value, which in traditional rational theory, okay, I mean they're just numbers. This is the equivalent amount. Therefore, this is supposed to be the decision. But sometimes no, it's not like that. There could be other reasons. Okay, and Kahneman would say that this is due to the vividness of the reality of what you're experiencing right now. Okay. Another thing that we talk about would be mental accounts and regret. Okay, the idea that okay, we do some mental accounting. So if I pay for this is how much psychic value I get from out of it. Okay, and that is not equal for everyone, right? Even if it's the same monetary value, but for us, mentally speaking, it would be different. Okay, and the idea of regret, wherein if you were to do something, okay, um, would you regret having done it? Okay, how much regret would you feel? Okay, and sometimes that idea of regret sort of holds us back to actually make that decision, even if that hasn't happened yet. But precisely because of regret, okay, we are now affected in terms of how we do our decisions. Okay, so again, these are things that do not help in the objective evaluation of the decision, but they impact us. They affect us still. Okay. And this would lead us to preference reversals. So in rational theory, they say preferences are stable, but no, in reality, no, preferences can even be reversed. You may like something now, but change the reference point, you would like something else. Okay, you'd like the opposite already, right? And this is where the idea of frames come into the picture. So how we frame the problem, how we frame the objective, okay, would impact on our decision itself, okay, even if we're talking of the same reality. Now, all these things, I mean, these are quite deep. Um, we've hadn't had an opportunity to really go into the specific surveys, the specific quizzes or tests that I've done earlier. But needless to say, in prospect theory, there are a lot of things to be considered, which if we now go to the applications, this is where it's going to be quite critical, okay? So, with all these things that we've learned, themes on decision, modern decision theory, you can either look at it as a vaccine, okay, to prevent you from being manipulated or from being or for deciding suboptimally, or you can look at it as a vitamin wherein you can now make improvements in how you decide on things. So, the first step here is gaining tempo. Now, when we talk about tempo, this is perhaps the first thing that comes to your mind is time. But tempo is not necessarily a continuous flow of events. The tempo can be discrete or individual steps. Okay, and this is where the adage, taking a step back, comes into the picture. No, all we need to do, okay, is to take one additional step, and that would be enough. We don't need to take so much time to decide on things, but we just need to take an additional step. Why? We want to let system 2 do its work. We want to let system 2 run its course, be deliberate, slow things down a bit, but not completely stop, right? But we slow things down. We try to gain tempo. We try to buy time. Okay, by taking maybe just one additional step. Okay, now another um, technique in order for us to make decisions better would be the idea of pre-mortem exercises. So if you're familiar with the post-mortem exercises, wherein it's after the fact, pre-mortem goes something like this. If this situation failed, okay, if we project ourselves into the future and it all failed, what could have happened? This exercise forces you to look at alternatives, okay, and helps you fight against the biases such as confirmation bias, representativeness bias, even availability bias and survivorship bias by looking at alternatives. Okay, now you've taken one step. Now you take a look at what are the alternatives here? What could be possible? Okay, another technique would be reframing the problem. So we just heard that just a while ago. Sometimes it's how you frame the problem. Okay, you change the frame a little bit. Okay, I mean, that might give you a different answer. That might even give you a better choice. Okay, you just need to ask: is this really the problem? Okay, and it's important that we establish the correct frame. Sometimes when people argue, they can be logically coherent. Both sides can be logically coherent, but why can't they agree on something? They're talking about the same issue, right? Well, it's because they're probably looking at different frames. So one way to resolve arguments is to make sure that both of you are actually looking at the same frame. Okay. And you have to acknowledge the other person's frame. Like, okay, so I see what you're trying to say. I see that this is your perspective, your frame of mind. Okay, and I'll share with you my frame of mind. Okay, so how do we go about with it? And more likely than not, you'd actually come up with an amicable solution, right? As opposed to just insisting that this is your perspective, that this is your frame of for your frame, your view of things, and ignoring the other person's completely different frame, right? And yet we're looking at the same reality. So establishing a correct frame is actually very important, very key for us here. Another technique is paraphrasing. So here we try to find logical equivalences. Okay, in the US, especially when it comes to pricing, they are now required to put equivalents of discounts or charges, if so to speak, right? So earlier we were talking about the credit surcharge. Well, they're now required to make disclosures of that sort. So in this case, okay, you're not simply looking at it from the perspective of a loss, you're also looking at it from the perspective of a gain. Okay. And now, by paraphrasing it, you're allowing yourselves to view both situations, both constructions of the same reality as a loss and as a gain. Okay. So another way would be how statistics are presented in public. Okay. You can do the statistics in this way. The risk of death would be 0.0001%. Okay. It can be logically equivalent to the risk of death is that one person out of 10,000 or 100,000 dies. Okay, they're logically equivalent, but the latter statement is more impactful because we can visualize, we can imagine one person. It can be you, it can be your brother, it can be your sister, it can be your spouse, it can be your child. Okay, as opposed to a 0.0001%. I mean, it's so hard for us to visualize or imagine that in our reality. Now in the US, if you're going to present statistics like this, you have to present both realities. So the idea there is that one technique for you to fight against biases, okay, and the traps of heuristics is by paraphrasing. You try to look for logical equivalences. Okay. The whole idea here is that every decision that has to be made has to be based on fact. Okay, it has to be data driven. It has to have a process. Okay, taking that deliberate steps to actually go through before making a decision. Okay, and in this case, we'll talk about some of the toolboxes that are already available. The tools. Okay, big data. Um, this topic started to gain some traction maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago. The idea of big data. Well, the advantage of big data is that it helps you fight against the law of small numbers, right? The more data you have, then the confidence, okay, the certainty is much higher, so to speak, right? The problem with big data is that it can be pretty cumbersome to use. Okay, I mean people would have difficulty managing big data. Okay, and that's why you have technology. You have a lot of um, advances in computing power right now to help manage that big data. Okay. Another item in our toolbox that would be helpful for everybody here would be decision support systems. Okay, so that has been in existence in the past. Okay, we've seen that in mission critical situations like air traffic control. I mean, if you allow a person to make all that judgment, which has happened in the past, okay, the risk of air disaster would be higher. But now, I mean, you've been able to really curb that with the help of decision support systems. Okay, simulation models. Okay, this is like an extension of your pre-mortem exercise. And you try to predict something in the future, running multiple scenarios. Okay, and definitely we see the emergence of the role of analytics and artificial intelligence, machine learning, so to speak. Okay, the only risk that I foresee here is because these things are also developed by human beings, right? Um, and there is that tendency of algorithmic bias, if you've heard of it. Okay? And this is very important, let's say in the United States, wherein there are laws on equal opportunity. Uh, And one way to curb against equal opportunity is to do hiring decisions through an algorithm. The problem there is that the available data actually censored all other possibilities, right? So if you're looking to hire your next CEO and the past CEOs that you have are all white, all male, then your machine will not be able to consider the possibility of having a black or a female or a minority CEO. Okay. Is that the fault of the machine? No. They're just using whatever available data that's provided for. Is that the fault of the person who programmed the machine? Well, no, not really. Okay. I mean, they're just only making things more objective. Okay. The thing there is that the availability of data. Okay. So at that point, you notice that okay, the past experiences uh, did build that data set that would be helpful for coming up with decisions on diversity and inclusion. So those are some of the challenges that you have when you try to use algorithms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, in trying to do better decisions and avoiding those biases. Okay. But the idea here ultimately is that when we have machines, when we have technology at our disposal, it is never an either or situation. It's not, it's either you manage an expert or you use a machine. It's both and. You help one another. Okay. You build the data in order to help improve your artificial intelligence, your machine learning technology, and you really make use of whatever technology formula, techniques, algorithms that's available for you in order for you to make that decision and not rely on your own gut feel. And so with that, I'm open for some questions that you might have. So I'll stop here for now and I'm opening the floor for questions if you have any. Okay. So it is 13 minutes past 12. So are there any questions from our participants? Okay, so if you have any questions, you can type your questions on the QA window below, or if you have any, or you can type directly in the chat box as well. So feel free to type your questions. Okay, so there is a question. Okay, so the question goes, okay, how do you think decision making, as you've discussed, can be used to address issues that do not have precedents like COVID? Okay, no, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Earlier we were talking about situations wherein uh, events or situations that have low predictability. Okay, and what are examples of situations with low predictability? For example, rare events. Okay, or in another book, you've probably heard of the black swan. Okay, these things do not happen frequently. There's no high frequency of precedence. Okay, so what we've discussed, okay, and part of it is, well, one, earlier, the idea of overconfidence. Okay, we might think that just because we're the certain experts in certain things, when an event like COVID happened, okay, that didn't have any precedence, well, we have to look at it honestly with a fresh pair of eyes. Okay, um, and that's perhaps, and this is just me speculating, but it could be validated, right? And this is where most of us fail to appreciate. Okay, most, maybe not us, but in other countries, they thought that they had all the experts with them. Okay, and they just simply relied on their experts to do the decision making. Okay, nothing wrong with that. Objectively speaking, there's really nothing wrong with that. On the other hand, you're faced with a situation wherein it hasn't happened before. So what do you do now? Okay. Well, one is to accept the fact that, okay, you have experts, you can use them. At the same time, you know that you're probably better off trying to gather as much or as many alternatives as possible. So one thing, where the things that we've discussed here, would be the idea of having multiple alternatives. Okay. I'll share a more concrete example, if I may, right? For example, the decision of uh, locking down a community or subjecting them to a community quarantine. Okay, that is one option. Okay, another option might be, okay, not to lock down the community, but to use preventive measures. Okay, or risk mitigation measures like wearing a mask, or now even including the use of a face shield, or having some physical distancing. Those are also other options. Okay, um, and the thing there is that there is no one perfect option there, right? Because and if we accept and realize that we're in a situation of low predictability, then anything would have worked. I mean, a paper, a position paper that I've said about this, and this is talked about decision making last April, was um, I wasn't really a fan of a lockdown, of a prolonged lockdown. However, I was agreeable to the idea we do a lockdown and we try other things. Okay. Because we're in a situation where you don't know what's going to happen. Okay. The predictability rate is low. Okay. So having multiple alternatives would be one thing that we've learned from today's session that we could use for other events. Okay. Um, what are other options? Well, framing. Framing is another concept that we can use. Okay. By understanding, okay, the idea of the lockdown, okay, we're actually using a frame that is used by the medical experts, okay, because their objective is to really contain the contagion. Okay, that's fair, that's valid, that's understandable. Okay. However, once we start looking at the situation with a prolonged lockdown, there are other effects to that lockdown that affected society. Okay. Okay. So now, by using the concepts of that we've learned about framing, we then reframe the situation. Okay, we need to take care of our health. Okay, that's a given. But how do we address the other things? Okay, and reframing would have helped us make perhaps a much better decision. And to be fair to our government right now in the Philippines, I think they've started to do reframing in their in the recent discussions in the last few months. Okay, and you see, okay, it's starting to improve. Okay, there are some improvements. Okay, in that situation. Um, but yeah, I mean, these are examples. And I mean, I also don't have a lot of time. Also, with the due to the time constraint, there could be other examples here that concepts that we've learned in today's session that we could use for situations with low precedence. Um, but yeah, those are two examples. Reframing, looking at multiple alternatives, and not trusting our gut feel just because we're experts in a certain field. Yeah, I hope I've been able to answer that question. Okay, any other question? So if you want to ask a question, you can type it down in the chat box or you can use our Q&A window. Okay. Or if you'd like to voice out your questions live, we'll try to open the microphone for you. Okay. Um, okay. Well, if there are no more questions, well, on behalf of the department, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this month's brown bag session. Okay. Our next brown bag session will be on January 2021 at the start of a new calendar year. Okay. And details about that particular session will be posted in the near future. So, wishing everyone a good day. Hope you had a great time. And see you again soon. Okay, bye for now.